Dr. Ramani, so great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us.
So good to see you, Helen. I miss you.
Yes, likewise. Maybe to start out, for those who maybe haven't already seen the YouTube channel and read your books, I mean, you already have so much expertise, an entire career as a full-time professor, before becoming literally worldwide in demand for the narcissism expertise. Can you tell the audience a little bit about what even brought you into this area?
It really wasn't until I started doing work in doing research, and I was noticing that there was a subset of clients that were, attending a community clinic that really seemed to be the ones that were demanding. They were hard on the staff. They were demanding of the staff. They were entitled. They were arrogant. They were combative. And I'm thinking, goodness, this is exhausting just to work with them. And these few people were sucking the resources of everyone there. So that sort of gave birth to looking at some of these things through a research lens. At the same time, I have a small private practice that got bigger. And then I was working with clients who were going through these relationships where they were chronically being validated and confused. I'm thinking, and I read it, I'm thinking, oh, this is really interesting. We're all of these people were coming in with these stories of these very antagonistic partners. And working with those clients and basically writing them repeated emails and notes culminated in my book, Should I Stay or Should I Go? But then I'm going to be frank with you, Helen, and this is how all academic change happens. I got angry. I got really, really, really tired of seeing the amount of human potential I was seeing second guessing themselves and doubting themselves and wondering why they're not enough and never being heard and having their reality doubted. Then there was a presidential election. And whatever anyone's politics are, the conduct of the person who won this election was very, very antagonistic and difficult and dysregulated and all of those things. And I thought, oh, now I'm just mad because I am really, really angry that the mental health profession wasn't willing to call this pattern out, the educational system wasn't willing to call this pattern out, that the healthcare industry wasn't willing to call this pattern out, and that not a single institution of support, law enforcement, no, was willing to call this what it was, and I was going to talk with it. I'm just going to put myself out there, and somebody needs to talk about this, and that's all that.
How would you define gaslighting to someone who is unfamiliar with that term? I mean, you kind of talked about what it feels like.
So, gaslighting, in its very, very simplest term, gaslighting is denying or doubting or second guessing the reality of another person. But Helen, it's actually a lot more complicated than that. I'm actually mired in writing this very long, article about gaslighting. And in doing this deeper dive into the research, gaslighting is actually more of a grooming process. It's not just something someone does to you once. It happens over a very long time. We can only be gaslighted if we at some level trust, believe in, or view some level of expertise in the gaslighter. And then because that person, through either expertise, authority, or just family, we trust them, they then have the ability to start poking at our reality in any number of ways. But the reason I call it a grooming process is that it doesn't happen overnight. The person who gaslights us does this gradually. They test the waters. When I do this to them, do they doubt themselves? Once they realize that they can start making this work, they go in deeper and deeper. The gaslighter's ultimate goal isn't just to leave you doubting your reality. It's to get your full-on consent and agreement. They literally entirely want to bring you over to their way of thinking and have you portray yourself to the world as though you're fully on board with their way of thinking. In that way, gaslighting is very much the best model I can give you is like somebody coming into a cult. That's an extreme example. We're gaslighted all the time when we speak the language of consumerism, when we speak a language of oppression. That's all of us being gaslighted by something we perceive to be an authority, and we go with it.
What do you see, and you alluded to this as part of what made you so angry, as the psychological impact on somebody who experiences gaslighting and maybe for quite a long time?
So a person who goes through gaslighting, who's experienced gaslighting, the layperson's rendering of it would be they literally feel like they've lost their mind. they actually start feeling like they've gone mad, as it were. They become anxious. They become confused. They're riddled with self-doubt. They start isolating themselves because they actually stop trusting themselves. You can see depression. You can see apathy. You can see fear. And then over time, you can see helplessness and hopelessness.
You and I have talked about cultural norms, and while that may be from South Asian or Asian families in particular, but there's other families too that may have very tight bonds spiritually or just more communal. But then what happens if there is, that term that I've really only heard you use often about tribe gaslighting, when maybe there's more than one person who's trying to convince someone like, he didn't mean that, or you're making a big deal out of nothing.
Gaslighting has its potency, like I said, that the gaslighter is trusted by merit of their office, by merit of their authority, by merit of the fact that they're a parent or a family elder or something like that. They have the power. We cannot always assume power and good behavior, respectful behavior, or compassionate behavior go hand in hand. It's an error many, many, many people make. And so what ends up happening is that gaslighting can almost have like multiplicative power if other people are on board with the gaslighter, in essence, enabling the gaslighter, and face a person with a united front, all saying, you're too sensitive, you're wrong, who do you think you are, you don't know what you're talking about, don't be ridiculous. That never happened, and on and on and on. I mean, Helen, I can give you such a basic example. If we were to look at a family where somebody was abused in that family as a child, sexually abused as a child, and the family engages in a lot of denial or minimization, because gaslighting can happen through various mechanisms, one of which is minimizing. You're making such a big deal out of this. It's not that big a deal. Stop exaggerating. So let's say somebody says, listen, this member of the family, is harming me or doing this inappropriate thing. And that the person who could protect the child minimizes it. And then other people close ranks, trying to keep the family from looking shameful, leaving the person who was victimized by this abuse absolutely isolated and not being heard, which we know, anyone who does trauma-focused work knows, that can really escalate the long-term impact of that trauma when there is not early intervention, and the person who experiences the trauma, when their reality is denied.
That's a great example. It makes me think of the research on survivors of abuse and how one of the most impactful factors in their resilience and recovery is the response of the first person they tell. Was it validating, accepting, supportive, or was it, oh, you can't say that, that's ridiculous?
So if the first person gaslights that survivor of abuse and the rest of the system closes ranks, which happens all the time in families, now you can see how this can have long-standing effects. But then, Helen, we can elevate this kind of gaslighting up even into institutional entities where the leader of the organization protects the perpetrator in the organization, and other people get in line with the leader of the organization. And before you know it, the person who's disempowered in that institutional setting now faces this, again, closed ranks. We're going to protect the institution. We're going to protect the leadership. We can't look bad. And we have heard story over story over story where the vulnerable in an institutional setting were repeatedly victimized, multiple victims, and the organization kept turning a blind eye repeatedly until the weight of the evidence became too much, or maybe the leadership shifted or something, and it was finally heard. I'm going to go out on a limb here because I'm going to say something that's incredibly unpopular. I have to say that something, and this is me simplifying something I've often been taught, which is this idea of individualism bad, collectivism good. Now, I'm the first one to say that individualism is very, very highly correlated with egotism and self-serving sorts of narcissistic structures. But this idea of collectivism as an automatically virtuous state where everybody has everybody else's back is a misnomer. And it's many times the people from the most collectivistic structures where the larger investment is in the group, in the family, in the whole, that this gaslighting by tribe can be its most virulent, because the idea of we've got to protect the family can't look bad, means that somebody who is, if not, maybe not even victimized, but somebody who deviates from the family system, somebody who may be coming out as gay, somebody who may be struggling with gender identity, somebody who's trying to take an iconoclastic path educationally or pursuing something that the parents don't want them to, all of a sudden they may get ostracized if they don't follow the family way. And the entire family will then say, you're ungrateful, you're a bad person, you're no good, how could you, you're so disrespectful. And all that person actually did was to speak their truth. And it's not even about fault, Helen, it's also about a person simply wanting to be their authentic self. Like a person who's simply wanting to honor their own truth, that in those kinds of cultural familial systems, if this, especially when the person in a patriarchal or a matriarchal or both positions are very authoritarian, are very entitled or arrogant or lack empathy or view emotions as weakness, now they're ruling with an iron hand. And people are giving them a free pass because they're the matriarch and we have to respect the matriarch. That's the patriarch. We have to respect the patriarch. And if somebody says, but they didn't earn the respect, that person will be, proverbially slapped across the mouth for speaking out in that way. And then what it does is that you can then see against the backdrop of a very toxic, antagonistic mother, father, or both, that somebody is suffering with that. And the children, most likely, who are suffering in that family system, nobody will throw them a line because, if anything, they're viewed as being ungrateful. And what's happening is, even if they do get help outside of the system, on the long shot that maybe they get therapy or someone intervenes, they're still being thrown back into that problematic, re-gaslighting, re-traumatizing family system.
It's funny how many conversations I think we've probably both had in the therapy room, that being grateful can coexist with having personal boundaries. A concept.
In bringing up boundaries, Helen, is such an important issue because obviously those will be more porous sometimes based on cultural, and on cultural variables. And then you have to skirt the line between somebody who maybe have a culture of origin and then a culture in which they reside, where boundaries may be managed very differently, which can also lead to some confusion. But again, these porous boundaries can be manifested as an intrusiveness that when a person, even using the most appropriate language, tries to sort of ask people in the family to maybe hold back and please don't be so intrusive, again, it's often met with, what are you saying? We're not being intrusive. We just love you. That's more of that gaslighting. And then the whole family, the whole tribe chirps in, well, that's just family. That's what family does. And it really, really, as you know this, having worked with a lot of first-gen students, that this can often have rather tragic consequences.
It's a very difficult task to assert your reality, or the ways that a person begins to, as you say, it's a hallmark of gaslighting. They doubt their own reality.
Absolutely. And so then you go from gaslighting by individual, that can be substantiated by gaslighting by tribe, but then it becomes gaslighting by self, and then it becomes complete capitulation and assent. And what may end up happening is that a person may not live their authentic life and completely cave in to the demand of the family because the ostracism would feel too painful, too isolating. And for somebody who may also have co-occurring mental health issues, anxiety, depression, anything that may render them vulnerable and maybe not even have the psychological bandwidth to mount the argument, capitulation may seem like the only way forward. And from a humanistic or an existential framework, that's a really, really hard life.
Yeah. And we've seen that not living our authentic selves can come up in our health and all kinds of other symptoms.
Because there is no too sensitive, right? There is that person's reality. And that honestly, if people feel like, I keep feeling like I'm overreacting to everything, I often wonder, are these the very people who never get to have that space in their life where people let them react as they deem fit. And then as they're allowed to have non-censored emotional reactions, they may even find that they don't judge themselves as sensitive because they feel like they've been given the space to do so. Mm-hmm. Many times in family systems, the only way forward is the family's way. The parents know best. We're going to tell you what to do. This is the only way you can. And a larger extended family weighs in. If the only path forward, maybe it's marriage, maybe it's a certain kind of a career path, maybe it's living in a certain region, whatever it may be, that there is no space to be the authentic self. And in fact, there's a certain terror in exerting the authentic self because it will be rejected. And so we kind of go into these sorts of these problematic, kinds of shallows of conditional regard that, often accompanies gaslighting.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any tips in particular for someone who's trying to figure out and distinguish, like, where's the fuzzy line between like a reasonable cultural norm and getting to that harmful gaslighting territory?
I think it all comes down to how we share information, right? It's the simple couples therapy technique of start your sentences maybe with I instead of you, and take ownership, but creating space to hear the other point of view. It could very well be that a family may say, listen, we only know that people get married and have children and have that path forward, but that if when it's handed as a mandate, you have failed us. What is wrong with you? Because when you say to someone, what is wrong with you, you have already diminished, right? And gaslighting is about a power differential. It's a person who's got trust, authority, and expertise talking down to someone who the more they push them down, the more power that they have over them. And so when you say, what is wrong with you? That's exactly when it has become gaslighting. But it's like, if a family could say, this is not what we're used to. This is something very new to us. Can you give us a little while to think about this and adjust? That's not gaslighting. It's still saying like, we're not down with this, but could we have a minute? That's very different. You're still clear that they don't like this.
Yes.
But it's very different than there's something wrong with you for wanting this other thing. I have a very traditionally Indian mother, and what I've seen is she's gotten older and I've gotten older. She's gotten so good at saying, I just don't understand your life versus that's not right. Mm-hmm. And I'm very grateful for that because then I actually have more empathy for her at those times too. Because then I think to myself, she doesn't. Mm-hmm. Why would she know more than I understood her life in many ways? That I try to, and I could see it and see it's different than mine. But by saying that she doesn't understand it, then I can also integrate her point of view saying she doesn't understand. We've had, in this generational leap between my parents and I, there's a very, very big difference. And so, of course, she wouldn't understand it. And so then, instead of feeling like I'm in an argument, I can feel more like I'm in a collaboration.
Mm-hmm. I often tell people, like, just stay grounded in health and safety, right?
Right. And that's still hard feedback because they themselves came from parents who were likely even more authoritarian, more directive, more commandeering, that they may actually felt like they've come a long way. In fact, that's something intergenerational I've heard in my mother who said, you have no idea how authoritarian my mother was. I mean, it was almost like it was commands. And, that it was that simple. And you followed them or the wrath would be terrifying. That's not at all how I grew up. So I can even see sort of the familial generational shift. But it is still the sense that, and I've seen this again in this very large Indian family I come from, and many of my South Asian clients, is that the generation that tries to deviate from the norm too much, there is so much pushback from so many people that you do feel like you're trying to penetrate a fortress. And that can be very, very unsettling.
Mm-hmm. Like a big psychological toll. If someone's kind of new to this or just kind of questioning, like, what are some ways to like avoid getting pulled into these manipulations or like noticing?
I think one of the hardest things is when you're slowly finding yourself kind of jousting at windmills and trying to avoid manipulation and gaslighting, is that you're so desperate to be seen and accurately heard that you can start wasting a lot of energy on constantly defending yourself and explaining yourself. The problem is you don't have a receptive audience.
Right.
Gaslighters only see their point of view. So for you to sit there and craft this long response. In fact, one of the classical mistakes I see people make is they say, they're not listening to me, they're not listening to me. I have an idea. I'm going to sit down and craft a beautiful email. And my goodness, they put more work into these emails than they do their dissertations. And they knock themselves out. And they send this beautiful, thoughtful email. And the family just gaslights it and rejects it out of hand. They don't want to hear it, not in writing, not in homing pigeons, not from your voice, nothing. So it really becomes about you yourself doing the deep dive with yourself. That could be in therapy, that could be with yourself, however you feel comfortable, that it could just be you speaking out loud to a friend about what your authentic life is about, what you want, what you hope for, what you're about, and that you've got to let go of this idea of converting your family. And I think especially in a collectivistic culture, the idea of not being embraced in that safe space of the family is rather catastrophic. So the idea of having to go along to get along, when that going along to get along is so far off what the person wants, that they're having to tread a very fine line, to which I say it's not about a choice, but it becomes about acceptance, that you may not ever get to a place where your family is signing off on what you want, nor do they want to hear about it. It does require you to be deeply acquainted with your reality. You cannot gaslight an ungaslightable person. A person who's ungaslightable is very comfortable with their reality. They know themselves, and as much as it's uncomfortable and it's hard to hold on to that when it feels like the world is trying to pull it away, you hold on to it. It's like, holding on to your pet while you flee from a fire. You're not going to let it jump out of your arms. You're going to hold it tight. Same thing with your reality. You're holding on to it tight and saying, no one's taking this away from me. And I've got to be very careful about whom I share this with.
In one of the books I've recommended to a lot of people, Stop Walking on Eggshells. One of the simplest techniques was sort of just that, like, broken record, and being able to say, I'm sorry you feel that way, but this is what I'm choosing. I'm sorry you feel that way. I might be making a mistake, but this is what I'm doing. And being able to hold that. Right.
Yep. And being consistent. And that, I think for many people, especially when you come from tribe gaslighting family systems, pleasing other people is in your DNA. So to break out of that people-pleasing mode and saying, yep, I'm going to do it this way, and feeling like, well, what does it feel like to not be on my throne? Like, what does it feel like to not be valued? What does it feel like that I am about to be, again, that I am not going to be held in that same position because I'm doing it my way? That is also a loss of identity. And one has to understand that in many ways you may have held back on this authentic journey because your family, it was comfortable, like an old sofa.
I work with a college population. Students will talk about sometimes sharing something they've experienced in their family that to them was a family norm, and having friends go like, wow, right. They talk to you like that, or and realizing there are different ways.
I love that, Helen, because it is a sort of a recalibration, which is why with each subsequent generation, as each generation of kids goes out, has different peers, has different friends, has different experiences, they do undergo this recalibration process. They start recognizing that some of these patterns in their family of origin, listen, we only know what we know, right? And so when these have been problematic, at times even abusive patterns, to have someone say, your friend may not even say that's abusive. Say, wow, this is how we do it. And you'll start to say, oh my goodness, that's very different. This is much healthier. That you then start to see there's an alternative path. When a person comes from one of these very gaslighted, one person gets to hold the reality kind of frameworks, is there can be a lot of shame. People will feel shame that this is how my family is run. This is how my family behaves. And it's almost like two very competing positions, right? And you get into this very tricky place of cognitive dissonance. My family, devoted to my family, I'm loyal to my family, I love my family. They are behaving in a shameful manner. That discordance is incredibly painful. At the baseline, what most people will do is they'll justify their family's behavior. Maybe it's not that bad. I'm making too big a deal. Maybe my family's okay. All families are different. Not, everyone's family's dysfunctional. And it doesn't have to be you call the family out, but take that moment where you're able to say, there is no shame in this. This is a family. This is the family I came from. It was not run well. I am not responsible for that, because I think what many people feel the need to do is take responsibility. But there is a shame. Once again, it's a new ostracism. And what a person may find themselves in is that they were bouncing between two forms of exclusion or ostracism, either exclusion and ostracism from their new host culture or exclusion and ostracism from their family of origin. So either way, you're choosing what is one of the most painful human experiences that there can be.
Yeah, right. Of course, we want to defend. We don't want our families to be judged. And yet, how can we keep sort of improving it? Like, I love the recalibration idea. I often use the word evolve, right? Because so often when we discuss changes in a relationship or family, it gets into that really black and white, like you're wrong or I'm right. When really it's about evolving and recalibrating and growing.
Correct. And again, the entire mindset of we can agree to disagree is actually a very foreign construct for many family systems. And again, especially family systems that are characterized by a very authoritarian, significant power, typically housed in a father, but it could also be a mother, that there is no agreeing to disagree. It's a totalitarian state.
And you had mentioned, early in your work about realizing that, a lot of clinical therapists don't get trained in this, right? Like we get trained in tools like this is how you facilitate healthy communication without time spent on, but what if one party isn't interested at all, right? They're not interested in that beautiful email. They want to learn to sort of twist the truth or manipulate. And, are there ways that therapists can improve their training and readiness? And also are there ways that potential clients can actually look for a therapist that actually knows about this and has some experience?
Well, I think, Helen, one of the struggles we have is that if I were to say the two areas where therapists may almost err to one dimension or another, one place they may err too far is let's just work on healthy communication. And I'm thinking, no matter how many I statements I use, no matter how much ownership I'm taking, this other person isn't listening, right? So the obsession that if you communicate right, it's all going to work its way out, that becomes almost like you just sort of feel that you just sort of keep going to this endless cycle that's not only getting you nowhere, it's leaving you more and more shredded and exhausted. At the other end are the people who may actually use too much of a multicultural framework and saying, well, this is the culture, this is the culture, this is the culture. I'm like, it may be the culture, but this is toxic. I get it, it is, but this is not healthy. And the idea that this has been this is their parenting model, we understand that, and we can view it through that frame and understand how the client probably already knows that. But then the danger becomes of enabling and excusing the behavior. What I want therapists to understand is that these antagonistic, conflictual, entitled, at times dysregulated personality styles that are often held by people who are quite vulnerable and insecure tend to be not amenable to change. The people who possess these personality styles don't tend to have that much self-reflective capacity. There is a very utilitarian approach they have to human relationships, which is everyone exists to get things done, and live according and adhering to my script. But it's the unchangeability of these personality styles that becomes very important. And then we have to look at how these styles are enabled, emboldened, and perpetuated because nobody wants to call them out. And I'm not saying anyone needs to roll up their sleeves and take someone's mother's side and say, hey, lady, you're a narcissist. Not by a long shot. In fact, you may never lay eyes on that person's mother. It's more of if a therapist can understand that all three of these things can coexist in their work, that we do need to view these things through a cultural frame so we can understand, even for our client, how destabilizing it is for them to feel this sense of I don't like my parent. I don't agree with my parent. It feels like heresy for them to experience that. Then there's healthy communication that's not getting anyone anywhere, but those healthy communication skills, while they may not help with that difficult parent, they could help with other people outside of this relational space. And then finally is understanding what these personality styles, especially in a parent, can do to their child, can do to others in the family, and how many of us unwittingly enable them by simply not calling them out. It is not okay to gaslight and manipulate another human being, culture or no culture, collectivist or individualist. It's not acceptable. And we have to have some no-fly zones here. And sometimes people will say, this parent had a difficult life. They had a difficult migration experience. They had a difficult refugee experience. I have no doubt about that. But that's often where the therapy can get stuck too. And we find the client again in the space of dissonance of, my parents gave up so much, they did so much, who the hell am I to be sitting here on my high and mighty authentic throne? I will continue to protect them, is that we have to teach our clients the very, very difficult dance of being able to respect, yes, this is where their parents came from, but it doesn't have to be enabling to the point where they become a sacrificed generation. You yourself, your parents went through a lot. They didn't go through all of this for you to also throw yourself under the bus. And so, but that is very slow, grief-oriented acceptance work that does not get done in one session.
Yeah, it's true. And I've had conversations like that, right? Like many of us are raised with this idea of, we have to make it worth it, all the things they suffered.
Exactly.
But you also realize at some point, that's actually not in our power.
That's
right? We don't have the power to fix someone's past needs and trauma. And when somebody does have that personality style, as you've pointed out, it's kind of bottomless.
It is.
That sometimes we finally reach a point in realizing it will never be enough. And that's not because you're not enough.
Right.
It's because what needs to be fixed there is not fixable by somebody else.
Correct. And the not enoughness, that dynamic of not enoughness is often generated by somebody who is bottomless. And like I said, we can simultaneously hold the sort of conflicting thoughts of, I feel so much pain for somebody who has this bottomless void in them. And that is not a license to victimize other people. And it's to be able to go back and forth between, I can feel empathy and compassion for them without enabling it or harming myself.
Yes. Right. It doesn't ultimately help them if you are super unhealthy. Yeah. I mean, it's worth noting that even the brief poll that we just had here, Michele had posted, 87% of even just the audience has said they've experienced gaslighting. 13%, like, not totally sure, but nobody said nope.
Well, and I will tell you now, if you are a person of color, if you are a woman, if you're LGBTQ+, if you are, at all differently abled, if you're not neurotypical, if you are older, if you hold some other stigmatized state, such as being overweight, you will, gaslighting is an oppressive state. That's what it is. And so it is because somebody holds the power. So they have the ability to run the narrative. And when you look at how shaped we are by the media, by social media, those are gaslighting structures. I mean, it would be like really me saying to you, Helen, Helen, you'd be so much better if you got a better jacket or better necklace. So I'm already demeaning you to get you to part with your money and purchase something. In its own weird way, even sales is gaslighting. But what I want people to understand is that the gaslighting process is more depth to, it's not a one-off. It's like, and because we're gaslighted by multiple structures, we're gaslighted by our culture and our society. We may be gaslighted by our families, and we may also be gaslighted in individual relationships. These grooming processes also require us to take a step back and ask ourselves, why am I imbuing this institution, this person, with so much authority and expertise? You can have a parent, you can have a boss, you can have a leadership structure and say, you know what? I understand why they're in that position, but I do not imbue them with more authority than me. And I think it's that idea of leveling that out makes us less vulnerable to the gaslighting. But it is such a universal phenomenon at this point that we're living into it as though it's normal. And the harm of that, Helen, is that then people have a greater likelihood of gaslighting themselves. This is my fault. I'm responsible for this. I must have misplaced it. It must be my problem, my fault, my issue, my sensitivity. And when you think about it, Helen, when people come in, at least I see this, when they're going through this kind of narcissistic abuse, to term it that way, in a relationship, one of the first things that often happens in traditional mental health circles is the desire to diagnose and pathologize the person who's enduring the abuse. Well, you're depressed. Well, you're anxious. Well, and I'm like, no, you know what? How about you try educating them about this pattern? And once they're well possessed of that, not saying that the pain is going to disappear, but they may be less likely to internalize it and say, oh, Lord, I'm in a difficult situation here, but I'm not broken. I'm not bad. I'm in a tough spot. That's a very different narrative. That's a very different rhetoric. And we tend to pathologize the people who are on the wrong side of the gaslighting. That's got to stop.
It's kind of like we talk about the one who is the truth sayer or calling out there's a problem is labeled the problem because we're breaking the status quo. We're pointing out something that, while true, makes people uncomfortable.
Correct. Right. That's right. So this idea of the truth teller, it's something. So I often, when I'm looking at sort of toxic, difficult family systems, we often see that there are roles people take in those systems. There are scapegoats. There's the golden child, sort of the anointed, prince or princess. There is the handmaid who really has been reduced to the role of catering to the needs of the parent. There is there's the fixer, the child who's running around in circles, exhausted, trying to make sure everyone's happy and nobody's arguing. And then, bless their hearts, there's handmaid, and then there's the truth teller. The truth teller is this poor, but I also think almost they have the sight. They're that child who sees it at a very young age. They just don't know words like toxic or narcissistic or antagonistic. They just know something's not right. And there's something energetically about these kids that the adults in the environment sense, and it unsettles them. They're like, somehow it's almost as though the toxic structure knows it's being seen, and there is often an attempt to isolate that child, silence that child, quiet that child, and sometimes that child goes on to become scapegoated. But that truth teller goes on into an adulthood where they're a truth teller and will still run into while they were probably more fearful of it when they were kids, as adults, they may endure more abuse, more gaslighting, more isolation, because they see a system, and they may have even been willing to call it out, which, well, that's a whole different conversation, because if you're going to call that system out, you are definitely going to become public enemy.
Yeah. I had a client say that they felt like their family was the Simpsons and they were Lisa Simpson.
Lisa Simpson's the truth.
Right. That she would read the things from outside their family and she would say, like, this doesn't seem right. And everyone would be like, oh, you just don't get it.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. And someone had talked about, we have a lot of good questions discussion. I know we're not going to have a lot of time to get into, but for those who haven't, for example, read, the two most recent books that Dr. Ramani has about Should I Stay or Should I Go? Relationships with a Narcissist, and Don't You Know Who I Am? And also the YouTube channel has a lot of short videos that address some of the questions that have come up, right? Like, how do you actually deal with this when you're involved, say, in a legal issue? Lawyers, like therapists, are not always actually trained in narcissism, right? What do you do when it's coming up in different settings? Romantic, work, family.
Yes. So it's listen, to me, the biggest part of this journey, whether it's family, whether it's relationship, whether it's legal issue, workplace issue, you name it, is to know what it is you're dealing with. Because at that point, you'll be less likely to engage in the same way. You won't lose yourself in the weeds of defending yourself, explaining yourself again, the long emails. That will all cease. And you can see it clearly. Listen, in legal situations, oftentimes your only defense is to document. I mean, listen, how many handshake deals with narcissists I've seen actually destroy people's professional lives forever. It's that, there's a carefulness you have to have in terms, again, of how you document, how you conduct yourself, how much you share, what you do. And so, but when it comes down to brass tacks, there's really two things we're talking about. First of all, is realistic expectations. You know what you're getting into. But then there's radical acceptance. This is it. Like, this is the situation you're in. And unfortunately, Helen, I have seen people in institutional settings where they've fought against this 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. After the 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, they finally just left. They thought, why did I stay this long? This wasn't going to change. And they had their reasons, but it's just like you'd see in a marriage or any other setting, is that it's not going to change. So you're going to have to figure out, if you're going to stay in it, what those workarounds look like and how to be realistic about what can happen here, how you're going to communicate in this. And that's that. And it is actually really sobering to hear that, because we live in such a fix-it culture that we can fix it. We can talk this through. We can negotiate this. Not this.
It's kind of like the old maxim, the very best predictor of future behavior is past behavior.
Yeah, it is. It really, really is. And, and unfortunately, because people say, are you that much of a downer, Ramani? Do you really believe people couldn't change? No, I think people have tremendous capacity for change. But there has to be that self-reflective capacity. And anyone out there who has made a sea change in their life knows this was an hourly commitment of learning new ways to speak and be aware and go through life. It's a snake shedding the skin, but in this case, it's us shedding a psyche in a way and rebuilding. That is hard work. And you lose a lot of people along the way. And, and Helen, that goes back to what you were asking about in terms of gaslighting by tribe. In some cases, a person has to finally go for a very painful sort of choice, in the sense of, I may not be able to fly or soar or be myself unless I really, and in a very permanent kind of way, distance myself from this dynamic. It's pretty rare, especially in family settings, and especially large collectivist in certain cultural patterns, to say, I'm going to step away from this in a permanent way, and finding a way to do it in a very heavily boundaried way. You're constantly, it's like a hedge you're always having to trim. You're constantly having to monitor that boundary.
Yeah. It's a really good point. Like, we know that people can change. I used to work in geriatrics, and people would say, like, old people can never change. And I'm like, it's actually not true. But the big if, do they want to?
They want to. And
the reflection and the will.
Yes, and it's also difficult people are much less likely to change, because they really have been holding systems hostage through their conduct for a very long time. There's an efficiency to what they do. I put out one video that is that's really one that's designed for people who have difficult or narcissistic personality style, saying, these are things to do if you think you're narcissistic. But the recommendations keep coming to the same place, which is to be constantly mindful of the people around you and of your effect on them. I can't tell you how many people got back to me and said, I'm not doing this. This is too exhausting. Yeah, it is exhausting. Just like you're exhausting to other people. And so for that kind of awareness to be, to hold that space, it's a massive commitment. It's like, it's like changing your diet permanently. Not easy to do. Not easy to do.
It's daily work. Yeah.
Yes, it is.
But I think that's a good message. How difficult is change, but doable for one who's committed. But also for those who are trying to decide if they're worth thinking this person will change, or how much distance do I need. That's a very serious thing to think about.
But I also think, Helen, is that you have to be very careful about conditionality too. Say, okay, I'm here with you, Mom, and I'm going to be here with you, and I'm going to support you through your change. Probably not going to work. I would say to someone, You go do you. You go be authentic. You live your best life. Do not ever be deliberately disrespectful to your mother. I don't think anyone should ever be deliberately disrespectful to anyone. In fact, to me, one of the greatest antidotes to all of the difficulty, antagonism, and toxicity we're seeing in the world is that we all double down on civility. And so even if I think someone is the most difficult, awful, horrible human being, I don't need to get up in their face. I don't need to say a single cruel word to them. I can distance myself. I can find clear, kind ways to communicate. People say, and you know what the big fear is in our culture is, well, that makes you a sucker. It doesn't make me a sucker. It makes me healthy, where I'm not having all those toxic neurohormones going through me that are caused by, getting in the mud with someone. And so let's say it is that example we're talking about, a toxic mom or a toxic dad, and to separate from the family feels verboten, but they need to make a change or this isn't going to work. You do not need to be an audience to their change. You can set boundaries, you can be compassionate and have your distance, but if they're going to commit to doing better, to being respectful, that's actually a journey they need to take on their own. And when they're done with that journey, then you can come back together. But the idea that you need to be the tour guide on that journey is very naive.
Not possible, and not someone's role.
Correct.
Right. But it's true. Sometimes that is the only motivation, is realizing finally that everyone is exhausted by me. Something is happening here. Yeah. And thank you, right? That we've definitely gotten in a place socially where the lack of civility makes it difficult to just be. Like I always say, it's very possible to set boundaries or do what you need to do with compassion. Like I realize people would say what we call personality disorders. It feels bad to be them,
It does feel bad. And I think it's important you say that, because to if you were to take a tour of the inner world of a person with a difficult or narcissistic personality, is to be in the mind of someone who in some ways feels that the world is a threatening and hostile place all the time. Somebody's always trying to get one over on them. There's almost a low-grade paranoia to it. It's a really jaundiced lens through which to view the world. I feel very sad that that's their worldview, because they miss out on so much beauty and innocence, and it's often replaced by them by a contempt. Oh, this is so ridiculous, or how could you do this, or what are you laughing about? And I'm like, oh my goodness, you only get one good run on this planet. Like, can't you see that silly fun they're having is joyful? And it is that, but everything is an attack, everything is a threat. And remember that the key core of narcissism is insecurity. And so to be that insecure, to feel things are so precarious, that the only protection you can have for yourself is entitlement or grandiosity or arrogance or validation or control. Those are all suits of armor against this fragile core interior. That's a hard way to live. It's like, that's a very heavy weight for them to carry around. And yet they do. I'd be in a bad mood too.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And to feel compassion for that, but also be like, this isn't my ability to fix. Right. Yeah. We have some things coming up. We're not going to get time to get into all the questions, but thank you. I think these are really helpful. I hope some of this you can find answers in some of Dr. Ramani's YouTube videos, because there are so many weekly, right?
No, we were doing them every day. Now they're 4 or 5 times a week.
Yes. So definitely look under there because there are categories that specifically address things like dealing with divorce, tribe gaslighting versus like relational, the ways that something like narcissism may partner with somebody else's codependency or other issues, right? That no one of us is like a pure specimen of whatever. Right. We do carry what our families of origin have given us, and then what we've developed as our coping skills, which may or may not be functional anymore.
Correct.
Yes.
Yes.
And that, I think for therapists, in the audience, really thinking about what cases do we accept? Where do we feel like we need to learn more? And for those who are in therapy, and of course, both our populations overlap, feeling okay to ask your therapist, do you have experience with certain things? And if not, knowing that you have the right to sort of seek someone who can handle this.
So to that point, Helen, I want to say something, because this is something that has come up with more than a few clients I've talked about. They will watch videos, mine and many other people's. They'll read blogs, they'll read articles, they'll read books. And then they'll go in to see a therapist they don't know. Maybe they found them through their insurance carrier. Maybe they just got a referral, whatever. And they go in and they say, you know what, I'm struggling. I think my mom's a narcissist, or I think my husband's a narcissist, and I need help. And the therapist will often angrily shut them down. Who do you think you are, using this term? And the client will feel gaslighted again. One of the struggles we have here is terminology. This word is narcissism has become a third rail. It is actually not really a clinical term. I'll give you an example. Let's say you, Helen, you and I are at dinner with our group, with our people that we used to get to go out to dinner with all the time. And we see somebody across the table and they seem much sadder, more sad than usual, and they seem a bit tired and maybe even tearful. You and I would have no problem turning to each other and saying, you know, I'm a little worried about Mary. She seems a little depressed. Or if she seems a little anxious. People would say, oh, how dare you? You're diagnosing her. Narcissism is an adjective. And it got co-opted to mean self-love. It actually doesn't mean self-love. But it is this pattern that's captured generically by this antagonistic, validation-seeking, arrogant pattern. And so I think that what happens is that when a client comes in, therapists need to learn to not shut the person down and ask them some questions and say, tell me more about this. You know, talk to me about what you mean. And that may then open up a conversation of a person then talking about how, you know, their emotional world has been silenced and denied. They have been invalidated at every turn in the road. And in doing that instead of shutting a person down and scolding them for using a term you don't want them to use, you open up a conversation. And what has happened in the world of narcissism is there's a lot of terminology that's unique to that world, like love bombing and hoovering. Even gaslighting was actually sort of an odd little word until probably the last 5 to 10 years. In fact, a lot of people don't even know the word only came into existence in the 1930s, which is when the play Gaslight came out in 1940, and then 1944. The two films came out. So this term's less than 100 years old. And it's a funny term because many people don't even understand it or where it comes from. So there's a whole vocabulary of this world. And so I'm actually, for those who are interested, next Saturday, the 10th.
It's October. Yeah.
Yeah, it's October. The 10th of October, I'm actually doing a brief training for therapists just to acquaint them to this area, because I feel like even if it's just something brief to say, here's some of the things to look for, but above all else, this is a group of clients where you never want to gaslight the client. Now, and again, I'll be getting into this on that day when I'm working with therapists, is it's not as though you just say, oh, and you don't let them forever walk around the world saying, I'm a victim of narcissistic abuse. You say, okay, now that we understand the pattern, let's give you some tools and strategies for how to manage this so you don't feel like you're always under siege, and then you can start taking responsibility for you. So I do think that we have got to learn to get a little bit more comfortable with this terminology, or find terminology like antagonistic, that we can all get on the same page with.
Right. I think that's a great place to wrap, not to get caught up in these words. That almost becomes like a gaslighting thing, right? We're here to debate a term.
Exactly.
Rather than the experience. And I think in one of your other videos, you'd mentioned, words like narcissist or borderline are so stigmatized, and really a descriptive term like emotional modulation disorder would probably suit us better and be more descriptive.
Correct.
But that, these are people on different levels and they are going through their own things, but how do we also make sure we don't become embroiled and harmed? And yes, and definitely those of us serving clients too, to learn more about how to handle this effectively, compassionately.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. So definitely thank you so much for being here
It was my pleasure, Helen. Worth it just to see you, my dear.
Yes.
Worth it just to see you. I hope this was helpful for people and illuminated them. And I'm doing more and more online content and classes and things like that, especially for therapists and coaches. All therapists, psychiatric nurses and MFTs and MSWs and, PhDs and PsyDs and counseling psychologists, everyone. Because if you do mental health, you're going to run into this issue. I can promise you that.
Absolutely. And for everyone, I know we didn't get to every one of your fabulous questions, but definitely take a look at Dr. Ramani's website and workshops and the books. They're incredibly useful. And I'm sure you will all have moments of like, aha, I know this person, or I felt this situation. Yes. So take care, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us in this remote world. Thanks so much, Ramani.
Thank you. My pleasure.